In the research methods section of the exam, you'll be given a stimulus, and then most of the questions will be based on the stimulus. It's a really good idea to write notes on the stimulus to give yourself clues about what might come up in the exam. I've written an unofficial exam paper for you to practice on, so if you're my students, pause the video now, read the stimulus, and then make as many notes as you can about the research methods that you can see, and then press play on the video again. So the first thing you should notice is that it says following previous research, and that means that you will write a directional hypothesis, because if there is following previous research, that means you can make a prediction about the results. The next thing you should underline is she put posters up at a university. This tells us it's a volunteer sample, and then you might also make a note about one strength and one limitation of a volunteer sample. So a strength of a volunteer sample is that it's ethical because people have volunteered to take part. But a limitation is that you end up with a biased sample because you only get a certain type of person who will volunteer to take part. So it could be that person is either really motivated or there's something about the research that they find particularly interesting. The next thing you should underline is that it says 20 student participants were recruited, because this gives you a clue that it lacks population validity. It's a small sample, only 20 students, and students are different to the rest of the population. They aren't representative of everybody. The next thing you should underline is the fact that the participants were not told the true purpose of the study. That should immediately give you alarm bells to do with ethics, so I would write ethics, and the people have been deceived, which was breaking one of the BPS guidelines, and that deception leads to a lack of informed consent. You might also make a note about how to deal with lack of informed consent. So you can deal with the ethic of deception and lack of informed consent either through a debrief, which is given at the end of the investigation and tells the true aims and purposes, and they can ask questions, you can offer counselling, or you could get presumptive consent or prior general consent. So presumptive consent means that you ask a similar group of people if they would take part after giving that similar group all the aims and purposes. And if they agree, then you can presume that your participants would too. Prior general consent means you give people a big list of possible investigations and they tick which ones they'd like to take part in or they agree to, and they know that there's going to be an element of deception. The next thing I would underline is the psychologist randomly assigned half the participants to a task. So you've got random allocation there, which we know is a control measure, and it's used to spread participant variables between the two groups of the independent variable. So the next thing you should underline is the fact that the random allocation has randomly allocated them, and it shows you the different conditions of the IV. So the participants will do a driving task in a driving simulator for 20 minutes while using a smartphone or not using a smartphone. So they've got the same task, the only difference, the condition of the IV, the independent variable, is using a smartphone or not. And so also you should pick up from this that it is an independent group's design because they're only doing one condition of the IV. Then I'd underline the number of driving errors was recorded because that is my dependent variable. That's how the researcher has measured whether the smartphone is making a difference to concentration levels. The next thing that I would underline is that the median score of the number of driving errors was calculated. So that median is your measure of central tendency, and I'd probably try and identify a strength and limitation of the median. So the median, a strength is that it's unaffected by extreme scores, which we sometimes call anomalies or outliers. However, a disadvantage or a limitation is that the median doesn't use all the data, or it might be misrepresentative. The last thing I'd underline is that it was the median was calculated for each group in order to make a comparison. And if you make a comparison, that means that you are looking at the difference between two different variables, the two conditions of the independent variable. So this highlights that it is an experiment as opposed to a correlational study, for example. So making these notes on the stimulus will help you in answering the questions, but please be aware that there may be other questions too. For example, they might ask you about a pilot study or a peer review. If you're my students, could you complete the exam paper which is the fourth set. And if you've lost your copy or you haven't got one, then there's a copy on Moodle that you can download. If you're not one of my students and you'd like to try a copy of the exam paper, then there is a link in the description below. And if you have any questions, then you can tweet me at blondepretzel, or if you're my students, just send me an email. Just to let you know that I've written 2 exam papers based from the same stimulus, so I've put a link to both of the unofficial exam papers in the description below.